Our little leech. The words, laced with an artificial tinkling laugh, struck me like a physical blow. I never imagined I'd hear such venom from my own daughter-in-law, Sophie, let alone at Westbrook Technologies' lavish anniversary party. The hum of conversation across the ballroom, filled with executives and their spouses, seemed to freeze. I stood there, clutching my modest handbag, acutely aware of the navy blue dress I'd painstakingly saved for special occasions. Beside Sophie, my son Michael offered a weak, apologetic smile, but said nothing. The company's executives, men and women Michael had worked alongside for 8 years, exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Oh, this is Martha, Michael's mother," Sophie continued, her voice dripping with contempt, utterly oblivious to the room's sudden tension. "Our little leech. She's always hanging around our house. Can't seem to manage on her own since Michael's father passed away." My cheeks burned with humiliation. 5 years. 5 years since Robert died, and this was how they saw me. A burden, a parasite. The pitying stares from strangers were a dull ache, but Michael's silent, frozen smile was a searing wound. I should find the ladies' room," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper, desperate to escape the suffocating gaze of the crowd. Sophie's laughter followed me, an irritating chime. "She's always been this sensitive. We practically have to babysit her these days." The women's restroom was mercifully empty. I stumbled inside, gripping the cool marble countertop, and stared at my reflection. A woman with streaks of gray in her hair, tired eyes, and a face etched with quiet resilience. A woman they knew nothing about. If only they knew the truth. If Sophie, in her glittering red designer dress, knew that the company whose anniversary she was celebrating, the very company that paid for her opulent lifestyle and Michael's luxury car, belonged more to me than anyone else in that room. I was the majority shareholder. I owned 51% of Westbrook Technologies. It was the company Robert and I had built from nothing, working nights, sacrificing sleep, mortgaging our tiny home for the initial investment while raising Michael. We poured our very souls into it. But I had promised Robert, on his deathbed, his voice a frail whisper against the hush of the hospital room. He had made me swear. "Don't tell Michael," he'd pleaded, his breath already fading. "Let him make his own way. Let him earn his position without living in our shadow." And I had kept that promise for 5 long years. I'd attended board meetings quietly, through a proxy, a trusted legal representative. I'd watched from a distance as Westbrook Technologies grew, as my son climbed the corporate ladder on his own merit. I'd lived simply in my small home, never touching the millions that were rightfully mine, determined to honor Robert's legacy. I had even welcomed Sophie into our family, despite her thinly veiled disdain for my modest life. Splashing cold water on my face, I straightened my shoulders. The woman in the mirror, though still tired, now held a glint of steel in her eyes. When I returned to the party, Sophie was holding court near the executive team, Michael dutifully by her side. Her red dress likely cost more than I spent on clothes in an entire year, but such material things meant nothing to me. They never had. "There she is!" Sophie called out, her voice too loud, too cheerful, as if we were the best of friends. "Martha, darling, come tell everyone about your bridge club. So adorable how you keep busy." I offered a polite smile. It certainly keeps my mind sharp. What Sophie didn't know, and would never suspect, was that my bridge club was actually a monthly meeting with my financial advisor, meticulously reviewing the performance of Westbrook Technologies and my other extensive investments. Later that evening, as the party wound down and we prepared to leave, I overheard Sophie whispering to Michael, her voice sharp with agitation. "We need to talk about your mother. She can't keep coming to these events. She's embarrassing, Michael. People are going to think you come from, you know." "She's my mother, Sophie," Michael interjected, but his voice lacked any real conviction. "And she's holding you back. Jenkins was watching when she spilled her drink. You're up for that promotion, Michael. We can't afford these mistakes." My heart broke a little as my son sighed, a defeated sound. "I'll talk to her. Maybe it's time to consider that retirement community we looked at." They didn't see me standing there. They didn't notice me slipping away to call a taxi instead of riding with them. On the drive home, watching the city lights blur through my unshed tears, I made a decision. For 5 long years, I had honored Robert's wishes. I had stayed in the shadows, letting our son find his own way, carve out his own success. But Robert never could have imagined, Sophie never could have foreseen how she would poison Michael against me, how she would make him ashamed of his own roots, ashamed of the mother who had given him everything. Tomorrow, I would call James Patterson, the family attorney who managed my shares. It was time to rethink my approach, not out of vengeance, but out of a deep, abiding love for my son, for Robert's cherished legacy, and for my own hard-won dignity. As I paid the taxi driver and walked up the familiar path to my modest home, the same home where we'd raised Michael, where Robert and I had dreamed of our future, a strange calm settled over me. Sophie had no idea who she was dealing with. The leech, as she so cruelly called me, was about to show her teeth. The morning after the corporate party, I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold beside me, staring at a faded photograph. It was Robert and I on the day we opened the very first Westbrook Technologies office. A tiny converted storage room with 2 desks and a boundless dream. I was 26, Robert 30. Both of us were exhausted, but beaming with uncontainable pride. "We did it, Martha," he had whispered in my ear that day, his voice full of hope. "This is just the beginning." Who could have ever imagined that tiny operation would grow into the multi-million-dollar company it was today? A company my own son worked for, never knowing his parents had built it from nothing. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reverie. James Patterson stood on my porch, his leather briefcase in hand. At 71, he was still sharp as a tack, his mind as keen as ever. He was the only person besides me who knew the full, intricate truth about my majority ownership of Westbrook. "You sounded upset on the phone," he said gently as I led him into the living room. I poured out everything. Sophie's cruel words, Michael's heartbreaking silence, their plans to ship me off to a retirement community. James listened quietly, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a thoughtful frown. "It's been 5 years, Martha," he finally said, his voice measured. "Maybe it's time to tell Michael the truth." I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the photograph. "Robert wanted him to succeed on his own. And he has," James pointed out gently. "He's earned his position, but Robert never intended for you to be disrespected this way." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a sleek document, the quarterly report on Westbrook Technologies. "The company's thriving. Your shares are worth more than triple what they were when Robert passed. You could buy 10 mansions bigger than whatever house Sophie's showing off to her friends." I took the report, my fingers tracing the pages filled with figures and charts. These numbers weren't just data. They represented Robert's and my life's work. Nearly 28 years of sacrifice, risk, and unwavering determination. "Did I ever tell you about the beginning?" I asked softly, my gaze drifting to the photograph on the kitchen table. before Westbrook was even an idea? James settled back into his armchair, giving me the time I needed, understanding the weight of the memories. We were so young when we met, I began, a faint smile touching my lips. Robert was working as a computer repairman, and I was a receptionist at the same company. We lived in that tiny apartment on Maple Street, the one with the perpetually leaky ceiling and the temperamental heating. I chuckled at the memory. Robert would bring broken computers home, fix them in our kitchen. I'd help him with the bookkeeping, order parts. We saved every single penny until we could afford to start the business. Those early years had been lean, but they were bursting with purpose. Robert would be writing code late into the night, while I managed the accounts, handled clients, made endless cold calls. Both of us were terrified and exhilarated as we secured our very first major contract. When I got pregnant with Michael, we were scared we'd lose everything. I continued, the memories vivid and sharp. I worked right up until my water broke, and I was back answering phones with Michael in a bassinet beside my desk 3 weeks later. I could almost hear the hum of the old computers, smell the faint scent of circuits and new wires. I remembered nursing Michael between client calls, Robert taking him for walks around the block when I needed to focus. Our baby grew up surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the boundless vision of his parents building something meaningful. Michael saw all of that, I said, my voice tinged with wistfulness. But he was too young to remember. By the time he was in high school, the business was successful enough that we could give him a more normal life. Robert wanted him to focus on being a teenager, not on the family business. When Michael went to college, I explained to James, we made the conscious decision not to tell him that his tuition was being paid by the company his parents had built. We even sold our home and moved into a smaller house, using the difference to make it appear that's how we were financing his education. We wanted him to find his own path, not feel obligated to join the family business. The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael had found his way to Westbrook anyway, hired on his own merits, working his way up without ever knowing the profound connection he had to its origins. Then Robert got sick. Cancer. It was fast and brutal. My voice cracked, raw with old grief. He made me promise, I whispered, the memory of that hospital room hauntingly present. He made me swear not to tell Michael about the shares. Said our son needed to stand on his own feet, that the company would be his legacy, but Michael's success needed to be his own. James reached over, patting my hand gently. Robert was a good man, Martha. But he couldn't have foreseen this situation with Sophie. After Robert's death, I had transferred most of his shares into my name, maintaining our controlling interest in the company. A small portion, a trust for Michael, would mature when he turned 40. Still 5 years away. As far as Michael knew, his father had left him a modest inheritance, nothing more. Sophie met Michael 3 years ago, I said, my voice heavy with the memory. From the beginning, she made it clear she thought he could do better than his simple mother, always making little comments about my clothes, my house, suggesting I needed looking after. And Michael allows this? James asked, his tone sharpening with incredulity. I sighed, a weary exhalation. He's caught in the middle. Sophie's ambitious. She sees him as her ticket to the life she wants. A life you could provide with the snap of your fingers, James pointed out, his gaze piercing. I stared down at the photograph again, at young Robert and Martha, full of dreams that had, against all odds, actually come true. I don't know what to do, James, I admitted, the vulnerability raw in my voice. I've kept my promise, but at what cost? James closed his briefcase with a decisive click. I think it's time we reviewed your options, Martha. Legally, The company is yours to control as you see fit. As we began discussing possibilities, I felt something stirring within me. Not vengeance, but a quiet, firm determination. Robert had wanted to protect our son from entitlement. He never intended for me to become a doormat. It was time for some changes at Westbrook Technologies. The following week, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. Visit Westbrook Technologies headquarters. Not as the majority shareholder, but as Michael's mother, bringing him lunch as I occasionally did before Sophie came into our lives. The gleaming glass building downtown was a far cry from our first office in that converted storage room. I signed in at reception, noting how the young woman behind the desk eyed my modest clothing with barely concealed judgment. "I'm here to see Michael Westbrook," I said, my voice steady. "I'm his mother." She looked skeptical, but called up to his office. Minutes later, Michael appeared, surprise and something akin to discomfort on his face. "Mom, what are you doing here?" He glanced around nervously, as if worried someone important might see us. "I brought your favorite," I said, holding up the bag containing his lunch. "Chicken salad on sourdough." His face softened slightly. "You didn't have to do that." He led me to a small break room instead of his office. I understood. He didn't want colleagues seeing his unfashionable mother in his workspace. As we sat, I noticed dark circles under his eyes. "You look tired, sweetheart." I ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's it made my heart ache. "Big project," he mumbled, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Sophie's been stressed too. She's got her heart set on that house in Lakewood Estates, and we can't afford it unless I get this promotion." I knew Lakewood Estates, multi-million-dollar homes, where executives and old money lived. Far above Michael's current salary, even with Sophie's income from her part-time interior design work. "That's quite ambitious," I said carefully, trying to sound neutral. Michael sighed, a sound of resignation. "Sophie says it's the right neighborhood for someone on my career track. She's already talking to designers." He offered a weak smile. "You know Sophie, once she sets her mind on something." I certainly did know. After lunch, I excused myself, ostensibly to use the restroom. Instead, I took a detour, wandering the gleaming halls of the company Robert and I had built from nothing. I recognized a few old-timers who nodded politely, their faces showing no recognition of the woman who held their company's fate in her hands. The executive floor was quiet, most occupants likely out for lunch. Suddenly, Sophie's voice drifted from a conference room, the door slightly ajar. She wasn't supposed to be here today. Curious, a prickle of unease raising the hairs on my arms, I paused. "Trust me, David, it's a perfect arrangement." Sophie's tone was intimate, in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. "Michael gets the promotion, you get the contract, and I make sure everyone's happy." A man's voice, low and amused, responded. "And how exactly do you plan to convince the board? They're notoriously conservative about the Asian expansion." "Michael has a presentation next week," Sophie purred. "I've helped him prepare it. Once he's VP of Operations, he can push through your proposal easily." "And what does your husband think about you meeting me like this?" the man, David, asked, a hint of mockery in his tone. Sophie laughed, a brittle, dismissive sound. "Michael sees what I want him to see. He's so desperate for approval. It's almost too easy." I leaned against the cool wall, blood pounding in my ears. Was Sophie having an affair? Or was this some kind of calculated business manipulation? My mind reeled. "There's still the matter of the unknown shareholder," David said, his voice dropping slightly. "No one seems to know who controls those shares since old man Westbrook died. Michael says his father left everything to some trust. The shares will come to him eventually. Until then, we work with what we have." There was a brief silence, then sounds that confirmed my worst suspicions. My stomach lurched. I hurried away, feeling sick to my core, the hum of the office suddenly a discordant cacophony. Back home, I called James. Immediately. He arrived within the hour, bringing along Sarah Miller, the former CFO of Westbrook, who had retired last year but still served as my proxy on the board. "Sophie's involved with someone named David," I explained, recounting the overheard conversation, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "They're plotting something involving an Asia expansion, and she mentioned Michael's upcoming presentation to the board." Sarah's expression darkened instantly. "That would be David Reynolds, smooth operator, runs a consulting firm specializing in Asian markets. He's been pushing the board to invest millions in a risky venture." "We've been resistant until now," James added grimly. "If Michael becomes VP of operations and advocates for it..." "They're using my son," I finished, the realization burning like acid in my throat. "There's more," I continued, explaining Sophie's comment about the unknown shareholder and Michael eventually inheriting the trust. James and Sarah exchanged knowing looks. "Martha," James said gently, "I think Sophie is planning for the long term. If she believes Michael will inherit controlling interest..." "She's positioning herself," Sarah finished, her voice cold, "setting up influence and connections for when that happens." My hands trembled, clutching each other. "And Michael, where does he fit in?" "Her plans?" Neither answered, but their silence spoke volumes. "There's something else," I admitted, the last piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Last night, I overheard a phone conversation. Sophie's been pressuring Michael to have me move to Sunset Valley Retirement Community. She says I'm becoming difficult to manage, and it would be better for everyone." James's bushy eyebrows shot up. "That's a rather expensive facility." "Yes," I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. "And apparently, Michael would need to sell my house to afford it. The house that was fully paid off. The house that, while modest, was worth considerable money in today's market." "This is getting concerning, Martha," Sarah said, her voice tight with disapproval. "Sophie appears to be manipulating both Michael's career and your living situation." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small garden Robert and I had planted together, the roses now heavy with rain. "I made a promise to my husband," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think he would want this." "What do you want to do?" James asked, his voice calm but firm, ready for my decision. I turned back to them, my resolve hardening. "I want to protect my son and the company we built. Not by revealing everything right away. That might just drive Michael further into Sophie's influence." "A more subtle approach, then?" Sarah suggested, her eyes keen. I nodded. "I'm going to attend the board meeting next week, not as Martha Westbrook, but as Mr. Wilson, the proxy shareholder. It's time I saw exactly what Sophie and this David are planning." "And if Michael recognizes you?" James asked, a hint of concern in his voice. I smiled grimly. "Sophie has made it very clear that no one expects to see Martha Westbrook in a boardroom. Sometimes, invisibility has its advantages." As James and Sarah left, making arrangements for the meeting, a calm, unwavering determination settled over me. Sophie thought she was playing a clever game, using my son as a pawn in her misguided ambitions. She had no idea she was playing against the woman who had built the very board she sought to influence. The day of the board meeting arrived with a pounding rainstorm, a fitting backdrop for the turmoil I felt inside. I stared at my reflection in the bedroom mirror, barely recognizing myself. Gone was the simple Martha in practical, unassuming clothes. Sarah had taken me shopping for the occasion, insisting that Mr. Wilson, the mysterious major shareholder, would certainly dress the part. I wore a charcoal gray suit with subtle pinstripes, a crisp white blouse, and low heels that still felt foreign on my feet. My usually unstyled gray hair had been expertly cut into a sleek bob and colored a rich chestnut brown, close to my natural shade before age had taken its toll. Sarah's stylist had shown me how to apply makeup that subtly enhanced my features without being obvious. "Perfect," Sarah said, appearing behind me, a proud smile on her face. "You look like exactly what you are. A powerful businesswoman who owns 51% of a successful tech company." I touched the delicate gold watch on my wrist, Robert's gift on our 25th anniversary. Robert would hardly recognize me. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "He'd be proud, Martha. You're protecting everything you built together." The Westbrook Technologies boardroom was on the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows, now streaked with rain, overlooking the city, now streaked with the relentless rain. I entered behind Sarah, who had coached me thoroughly on how Mr. Wilson would behave: confident, reserved, observant. Heads turned as we entered. I recognized most of the board members from the reports James had provided over the years, though I'd only met a select few in person. Michael sat near the middle of the long table, looking visibly nervous. At the far end sat Sophie, who technically had no position at the company, but had apparently been invited for this special presentation. Beside her was a handsome man in his early 40s. David Reynolds, I presumed. "Ah, Sarah," said Richard Foster, the board chairman, his gaze lingering on me. "And this must be Mr. Wilson." Sarah supplied smoothly. "Indeed, Mr. Wilson is here to observe today's proceedings." Murmurs circulated the room. The mysterious majority shareholder had sent proxies to meetings for years, but had never once appeared in person. I offered a polite nod, but said nothing, taking the seat Sarah indicated near the head of the table. Michael was already staring at me, a slight frown creasing his brow, as if trying to place my face. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Would he recognize his own mother beneath the tailored suit and new hairstyle? His gaze eventually moved on, though a flicker of unease remained. Sophie leaned over to whisper something to David, both of them looking suspiciously in my direction. I opened the sleek leather portfolio Sarah had provided, acting absorbed in the meeting agenda. The meeting proceeded with routine business first. I spoke only when necessary, keeping my comments brief and direct, just as Sarah had advised. Michael continued to glance at me periodically, that puzzled look returning each time. Sophie was less subtle, openly studying me with narrowed eyes, her suspicion almost palpable. Finally, Richard announced, "Next item, presentation on the proposed Asian market expansion by Michael Westbrook." Michael stood, straightening his tie nervously, and moved to the front of the room. As he began his presentation, I could see so much of Robert in him. The same earnest intelligence, the careful, methodical way he explained complex concepts. But I also saw something Robert never had: an undercurrent of desperation, a need to impress at all costs. His proposal involved opening offices in Singapore and Shanghai, with a significant investment in speculative software development tailored to Asian markets. The numbers he projected were ambitious, bordering on fantasy. "As you can see," Michael concluded, gesturing to a slide, "our projected return on investment would be 27% within 18 months, with potential for exponential growth thereafter." I glanced around the table. Most board members looked skeptical, their expressions ranging from doubt to outright disbelief. David Reynolds, however, was nodding enthusiastically, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Very impressive, Michael," David said, his voice smooth. "If I may add, My consultancy has extensive connections in both markets. We could facilitate immediate entry points, significantly reducing typical startup costs. Sophie beamed at Michael, her smile radiating a manufactured pride that grated on my nerves. I felt a wave of nausea watching her performance. Richard, the chairman, looked unconvinced. The investment required is substantial, Mr. Westbrook, and these projections seem conservative, actually, David interjected smoothly, cutting off the chairman. My team has compiled extensive market research. I'd heard enough. I cleared my throat softly, and the room, once alive with Michael's ambitious projections, fell into a sudden, expectant silence. All eyes turned to me. Mr. Westbrook, I said, addressing my own son formally, my voice measured and composed. Your enthusiasm is commendable. However, I see several flaws in your proposal. I proceeded to ask pointed questions about his market analysis, the glaring holes in his risk assessment, and the complete lack of contingency planning. With each question, Michael's confidence visibly deflated, his shoulders slumping slightly. Sophie's expression, initially confusion, quickly twisted into anger. Who exactly are you to question this proposal? She finally interrupted, her voice sharp with indignation. Michael has worked extremely hard on this presentation. Sophie, Michael muttered, his face reddening with embarrassment at her outburst. No, Michael, she snapped, ignoring him. Some mysterious shareholder who never bothers to show up suddenly appears and starts undermining you? That's not right. I met her gaze steadily, allowing no emotion to show on my face. Mrs. Westbrook, I am simply doing due diligence as a major investor in this company. Your husband's proposal risks millions of dollars on projections that appear to have been influenced by outside interests. I glanced meaningfully at David Reynolds, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Richard and the other board members were watching the exchange with growing, keen interest. I move that we table this proposal pending further review, I said calmly, addressing the chairman. And I suggest we investigate Mr. Reynolds' relationship with Westbrook Technologies more thoroughly before proceeding with any partnership. The vote was quick and decisive. Michael's proposal was tabled. As the meeting adjourned, Sophie stormed out, David following close behind, a muttered expletive on his lips. Michael lingered, looking utterly defeated. I approached him, conflicted. Part of me yearned to comfort him, to envelop him in a mother's embrace. Instead, I spoke as, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Westbrook, your basic concept has merit. The execution, however, needs work. I'd be willing to discuss improvements if you're interested. He looked up, surprised, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. Thank you, Miss Wilson. I'd appreciate that. As I turned to leave, he added, a hint of recognition in his voice. Have we met before? You seem familiar. My heart skipped a beat. Perhaps in passing. I knew your father. His eyes widened slightly, but before he could respond, Sarah appeared at my elbow, gently easing me toward the door. In the elevator, I finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath. That was harder than I expected. You did well, Sarah assured me, a proud smile on her face. The board was impressed, and you've bought time to address the real problem. Sophie, I said, the name a bitter taste in my mouth. And this David person, they're using my son. What will you do now? Sarah asked as we reached the lobby. I stared at my unfamiliar reflection in the mirrored elevator doors. The decision I'd been wrestling with for days crystallized in that moment. It's time to tell Michael the truth, I said quietly, firmly. Not everything at once. That might push him away, but enough so he understands what's really happening. Sarah nodded. When? I'll invite him to dinner tomorrow, alone. As we stepped outside into the relentless rain, I felt both terrified and resolute. 5 years of honoring Robert's wishes, of staying silent while Sophie gradually isolated my son from me. Tomorrow would change everything. What I didn't know then was that Sophie had already set a different plan in motion, one that would force my hand sooner than I expected. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, rehearsing what I would say to Michael when he came for dinner. By morning, dark clouds had gathered both outside my window and inside my mind. I was making coffee when my phone rang. "James?" I answered, my voice laced with anxiety. "Martha, we have a situation," he said without preamble. "Sophie's made a move. She's convinced Michael to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." My hand froze on the coffee pot. "What? On what grounds?" "They're proposing a restructuring of the executive team. If it passes, several board members loyal to you would be removed." His voice tightened. "And there's more. She's somehow gotten wind that Mr. Wilson is connected to you." "How is that possible?" I asked, my mind racing, a chill spreading through me. I was going to tell him tonight. "I don't know, but Michael called Sarah this morning asking direct questions about your involvement. He sounded agitated." I set the coffee pot down with a shaking hand. "I was going to tell him everything tonight." "You may not have that luxury," James cautioned. "Martha, if Sophie has convinced Michael you've been deceiving him all these years—" The doorbell rang, interrupting him. "Someone's here. I'll call you back." Through the peephole, I saw Michael standing on my porch, his expression stormy, his jaw clenched. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and opened the door. "Michael, I wasn't expecting you until—" "Were you ever going to tell me?" he demanded, pushing past me into the hallway, his voice raw with disbelief and betrayal. "Or was the plan to keep lying to me forever?" I closed the door, my heart pounding a desperate rhythm. "Michael, please let me explain." "Explain what?" he retorted, spinning to face me. "That you're actually Mr. Wilson? That you've owned the company all this time? That my entire career has been—" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so painfully like his father's. "What, Mother? A joke? Some kind of test?" "No," I said firmly, stepping closer. "Never that. Please sit down. Let me tell you everything." Reluctantly, he followed me to the living room but remained standing, arms crossed, his gaze a mixture of anger and confusion. "How did you find out?" I asked gently, wanting to understand the full scope of Sophie's treachery. "Sophie?" he said, the name a bitter accusation. "She hired a private investigator after the board meeting. She thought there was something strange about this Wilson person who appeared out of nowhere and tanked my proposal." I closed my eyes briefly, a wave of resignation washing over me. Of course she had. "Is it true?" Michael demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you control Westbrook Technologies?" I looked my son in the eyes, my gaze steady, resolute. "Yes. Your father and I founded the company before you were born. When he died, I inherited his shares. I own 51% of Westbrook." Michael stared at me as if seeing a stranger, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the unassuming mother he thought he knew. "All these years," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You've been living here in this modest house, driving that old car, while you were worth millions?" "Yes," I confirmed, my voice quiet but firm. "Why?" The word came out like an accusation, laden with pain. "Why would you hide this? Why would you let me work there not knowing? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" "It was your father's wish," I said, stepping closer, wanting him to truly hear me. "He wanted you to succeed on your own merits, not because you were the owner's son. He believed it would make you stronger, more independent. And you? Michael's voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his hurt. What did you want? The question pierced my heart. I wanted to honor your father's dying wish, I said, my voice quiet. But I also wanted to protect you. Michael scoffed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. Protect me? From what? Success? Wealth? Knowing my own heritage? From never knowing if you'd earned your position, I explained, willing him to understand. From the doubt that would have followed you if everyone knew you were the boss's son. Your father built this company so you could have a life of choice, not obligation or inherited ease. He was silent for a long moment, processing, his gaze fixed on some unseen point across the room. And the board meeting yesterday, he finally said, his voice flat. What was that about? I chose my words carefully, navigating the delicate balance of truth and caution. I had concerns about the proposal. The projections seemed unrealistic, and I was worried about the involvement of David Reynolds. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of defensiveness in their depths. What about David? Sophie says he's brilliant. She says the board is too conservative, afraid of innovation. His tone told me everything about his state of mind. He was already conditioned to trust Sophie's judgment. Michael, I said gently, have you looked into David's background? His track record with other companies? Uncertainty flickered across his face. Sophie did the research. I think you should do your own, I suggested, my voice firm. Before tomorrow's board meeting. His jaw tightened. You know about that too. Yes, I admitted. And I need you to understand something important, Michael. The restructuring Sophie is proposing would remove the very people who helped your father build this company. People who have protected its integrity for decades. Sophie says they're blocking progress, he countered, but with noticeably less conviction now. I moved to my desk and pulled out a folder, the one James had prepared months ago when we first noticed David Reynolds circling the company. This contains information about Reynolds's previous ventures. 3 companies that invested in his Asian expansion plans. All 3 suffered significant losses. 1 filed for bankruptcy. Michael hesitated, then slowly took the folder, his fingers brushing mine. Why should I believe anything you say now? He asked, his voice laced with the pain of perceived betrayal. You've been lying to me for years. The accusation stung, a sharp, familiar pain, but I understood his hurt. I haven't been completely honest about my role at Westbrook. That's true, I conceded. But I have never lied about loving you or wanting what's best for you. He looked away, blinking rapidly, a subtle tremor in his jaw. Michael, I said softly, my voice filled with pleading. Think about how quickly Sophie found this information about me. Less than 24 hours after the meeting. She must have already been investigating. Already suspicious. She was protecting me, he insisted, but the doubt had already crept into his voice, a faint, undeniable crack. Was she? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Or was she protecting her own interests? He stood abruptly, the folder clutched in his hand. I need time to think, to process all this. Of course, I said, rising too. But Michael, please, before tomorrow's meeting, look at that folder and ask yourself why Sophie is pushing so hard for this restructuring. Ask yourself what her true motivations are. At the door, he paused, his hand on the knob. All those board meetings over the years, you were there, weren't you? As Mr. Wilson's proxy, I nodded. I wanted to stay connected to what your father and I built, and to you. Something shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness yet, but a subtle crack in his anger, a flicker of something new. The board meeting is at 9. Tomorrow, he said, his voice flat. I suppose you'll be there. I will, I confirmed, my resolve firm. As myself this time. No more proxies. After he left, I called James and Sarah, updating them on the confrontation. We spent hours strategizing, calling loyal board members, preparing for every possible scenario Sophie might unleash. By evening, I was utterly exhausted but resolute. Tomorrow would decide everything, not just the future of Westbrook Technologies, but my strained relationship with my son. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. It contained a single photo: Michael and Sophie having dinner with David Reynolds. All three looked grim and determined. Beneath the photo was a chilling message. They're planning something bigger than a restructuring. Be prepared. I stared at the screen, a cold dread washing over me, wondering who my mysterious ally was. Then, I recognized the familiar restaurant in the background, and the waitress partially visible at the edge of the frame. It was Diane, Robert's niece, who had waited tables at that restaurant for years. She had recognized Michael, Sophie, and clearly found their conversation concerning enough to warn me. I sent back a simple, "Thank you," and set my phone aside, a new, daring plan forming in my mind. If Sophie wanted to play hardball, she'd find I was more than capable of stepping up to the plate. Tomorrow, Martha Westbrook would finally take her rightful place at the head of the table. The Westbrook Technologies boardroom fell silent, every murmur dying as I walked in. No disguise today, just Martha Westbrook in a simple but elegant navy suit. My silver hair neatly styled, Robert's gold watch gleaming on my wrist. Board members who had known me for years, but only as Michael's unassuming mother, or as Sarah's mysterious client, stared in confusion, then outright shock. Sophie, already seated beside Michael near the head of the table, looked like she'd been slapped, her face a mask of disbelief. David Reynolds, on Michael's other side, leaned over to whisper something in his ear. "What is she doing here?" Sophie hissed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, laced with outrage. "This is a closed board meeting." Richard Foster, the chairman, looked equally confused. "Mrs. Westbrook, I'm afraid—" "It's quite all right, Richard," I said calmly, my voice resonating with an authority I hadn't used in years as I placed my leather portfolio on the polished mahogany table. "I believe you'll find I have every right to be here." James Patterson entered behind me, carrying his briefcase, his expression solemn. "Mrs. Westbrook is here in her capacity as majority shareholder of Westbrook Technologies," he announced, his voice clear and deliberate. "She holds 51% of the company shares." A collective gasp rippled through the room. All eyes, now wide with astonishment, turned to Michael, who sat rigid, his expression unreadable, a silent battle raging within him. "This is ridiculous!" Sophie sputtered, scrambling to her feet. "Michael's father owned the company. The shares are in a trust until Michael turns 40. I finished for her, my gaze firm, unwavering. "Yes, a small portion are, but the controlling interest passed to me upon Robert's death, as per his will and our prior agreement." "Me upon Robert's death, as per his will and our prior agreement." Richard looked utterly bewildered. "But Miss Miller has been voting those shares for years as my proxy," I confirmed, cutting him off smoothly. "And as Mr. Wilson when necessary." Another shockwave visibly passed through the room, murmurs breaking out. David Reynolds's smooth composure finally cracked, a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. "Mrs. Westbrook has documentation confirming all of this," James added, pulling a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "Which I'll happily provide to each board member, but perhaps we should address the purpose of today's emergency meeting first." I took a seat directly across from Michael, our eyes meeting briefly before he looked away, his expression a complex mix of hurt and something new, uncertainty. "Yes, let's proceed," Richard agreed, visibly gathering himself. "Michael, you called this meeting to propose restructuring the executive team." Michael cleared his throat, his gaze still fixed on the table. "Actually," he began, his voice a little shaky but gaining strength, "in light of recent information, I'd like to propose a different agenda." Sophie whipped her head around to stare at him, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "Michael, we discussed this. Stick to the plan." A tense silence followed, thick with unspoken accusations. Michael looked down at the folder in front of him, the one I'd given him the day before, containing all the damning evidence about David Reynolds's failed ventures. He took a deep breath. "I spent last night doing additional research," Michael said slowly, his voice growing steadier with each word. "About our company's history, about David Reynolds's business record, and about the Asian expansion proposal." He looked up, his gaze moving from Sophie to David, then finally to me. "I found some troubling inconsistencies." "Michael!" Sophie warned, her voice tight, a dangerous edge to it. He ignored her, his focus now solely on the board members. "Mr. Reynolds has been involved with 3 companies that attempted similar expansions into Asian markets. All 3 suffered significant losses, with one filing for bankruptcy." David's smooth smile turned cold. "Markets involve risk, Michael. Your father understood that." "My father," Michael repeated, emphasizing the word, "built this company with careful growth strategies. He never gambled with his employees' livelihoods." I felt a surge of pride so strong it almost brought tears to my eyes, hearing Michael defend Robert's principles. "Furthermore," Michael continued, his voice now firm, "I discovered that the projections in my proposal were based on manipulated data." He turned his gaze directly to Sophie. "Data you helped prepare." Sophie's face flushed a furious red. "You're being ridiculous. I was helping you." "Were you?" Michael challenged, his voice quiet but sharp. "Or were you helping David secure a multi-million-dollar consulting contract?" David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to these accusations." "Actually, you do," I interjected, my voice cutting through the tension. "Because the board should also know about your previous relationship with International Tech Partners, the company you recommended as our Asian manufacturing partner." I nodded to James, who immediately began distributing more documents. "A company where you were previously a silent partner and still receive consulting fees," the board members murmured, their voices low with shock as they reviewed the damning evidence. "This is a witch hunt!" David snapped, his face contorted with rage. Michael stood slowly, matching David's height. "No, it's due diligence," he said, his voice laced with regret. "Something I should have done before bringing this proposal forward." He faced the board. "I withdraw my proposal for Asian expansion and recommend we sever all ties with Reynolds Consulting." "Michael!" Sophie grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. "You're ruining everything." He pulled away from her, his gaze firm, unwavering. "No, Sophie. I'm stopping us from making a terrible mistake." He turned to face her fully, his voice low and resolute. "Just like I'm stopping us from making a terrible mistake about my mother." Sophie's expression turned venomous, her face contorting with rage. "Your pathetic mother has been lying to you for years. She's been controlling your career, manipulating everything from the shadows." "My mother," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying surprising authority, "has been honoring my father's wishes while protecting the company they built together." He looked at me then, his eyes softening. "Something I'm only beginning to understand. Richard cleared his throat, sensing the shifting tide. In light of these revelations, I believe we should adjourn to consider next steps. As the board members filed out, a flurry of hushed whispers and astonished glances, Sophie remained seated, her face a mask of furious disbelief. "You've ruined everything!" she hissed at me, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "We had it all planned. The promotion, the house, everything." "You had it planned," Michael corrected her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Using me as your stepping stone." "Don't be naive, Michael," she snapped, rising to her feet. "Everyone uses everyone. Your precious mother used you too, keeping you in the dark while she controlled everything." "There's a difference," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "She did it out of love. You did it out of greed." Sophie grabbed her purse, her knuckles white. "This isn't over," she threatened, glaring at both of us with burning hatred before storming out, David trailing sheepishly behind her. Finally, Michael and I were alone in the boardroom, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. "I'm still angry with you," he said after a long moment, his voice raw. "You should have told me the truth years ago." "I know," I admitted, my voice thick with regret. "Keeping your father's promise became a habit, then a shield. I was afraid if I told you, I'd lose you. Instead, you almost lost me to Sophie's manipulations." He shook his head slowly, processing. "When did you know about her and David?" "I suspected at the company party," I said, recounting the details. "Then confirmed it when I overheard them at the office yesterday." He nodded slowly. "Last night, after I left your house, I called some former colleagues who had worked with David. Everything you said was true." His voice caught. "And then I started wondering what else you were right about." "Sophie?" I asked gently, my heart aching for his pain. "I checked her phone while she was in the shower," he admitted, his gaze falling to his hands. "The texts between her and David. They've been planning this for months, using me as their ticket into the company." He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Was I that blind, Mom?" The word, Mom, so simple, so powerful, broke something open inside me. I reached across the table, taking his hand. "We see what we want to see in the people we love," I said softly, squeezing his hand. "I've made my own mistakes." Michael came around the table and took the seat beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "What happens now? With the company? With us?" I squeezed his hand again. "That's up to you. Your father wanted you to make your own way, and you have. You're a good businessman, Michael, with or without the Westbrook name behind you." "And Sophie?" I paused, weighing my words carefully. "That's also your decision. But speaking as both your mother and the majority shareholder of this company, I'd recommend some serious reconsideration of that relationship." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Already ahead of you. I packed a bag this morning." 2 months later, I sat in the same boardroom, watching, with a surge of pride, as Michael presented a new proposal, a meticulously researched plan for expanding our educational software division. Sophie was gone from his life, though the divorce proceedings were just beginning. David Reynolds had disappeared, moving on to other unsuspecting marks. Michael had moved into the guest house on my property, temporarily, he said, though we both knew he was healing from more than just a failed marriage. He was reconnecting with his roots, with the quiet strength of the legacy his father and I had painstakingly built. And so, Michael concluded his presentation, his voice clear and confident. "I believe this expansion stays true to Westbrook's core values, while positioning us for sustainable growth. Thank you, Michael, I said from my place at the head of the table, a position I had finally, publicly claimed. The board will vote now. The proposal passed unanimously. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached me, a warm smile on his face. Martha, I've been meaning to tell you. Robert would be so proud of how you've handled everything. I smiled, touching the gold watch on my wrist, a silent tribute to my late husband. I think he would be prouder of Michael for finding his own way, just as Robert wanted. Later that evening, Michael and I sat on the back porch of my home, our home now, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, much as Robert and I had done for so many years. Mom, he said thoughtfully, breaking the comfortable silence. I've been thinking about the company name. Oh? I took a slow sip of my tea, curious. Everyone associates Westbrook with Dad, but you were always there too. Maybe it's time for a small change. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledging the full story. What did you have in mind? I asked, my heart quickening. Westbrook and Wilson Technologies? He suggested, his eyes sparkling with a renewed sense of purpose. Honoring both legacies. I felt tears prick my eyes, a warmth spreading through me. Your father would like that. And the mysterious Mr. Wilson? Michael asked with a small, knowing smile. Will she make any more appearances? I laughed softly, a genuine, heartfelt sound. I don't think so. Martha Westbrook is finally ready to step into the light. As the last rays of sun gilded the garden Robert and I had planted so long ago, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. Sophie had called me a leech, never knowing that I was actually the foundation of everything she coveted. Now the truth was out, and with it came not the vengeance I might have sought, but something far more valuable, redemption, reconnection, and the chance to finally honor both Robert's legacy and my own. Sometimes, I reflected, the greatest power comes not from hiding in the shadows, but from finally stepping forward to claim your rightful place in the sun.